Hello everyone, this is Dr. Willow Ariella coming to you to talk to you about validity in Chapter 8 and general overview on statistics. Don't freak out, we won't be doing any statistics in this class, but just talking about some of them. Okay, so just so you know, I had to study internal external validity quite a bit to kind of get it. Some of them seem a little bit more clear than others, so you know, if they're not that clear to you, don't freak out. You'll get it eventually. Keep looking at how people talk about internal and external validity in various research reports and texts like this one, as well as other sources, and you'll get the hang of it. You'll figure out what they're talking about. So, you know, I had to study it a lot. So just keep that in mind. It's interesting because I never really thought about the word threat. You know, the textbook talks about threats to internal validity, and we never really talked about what that meant. It was sort of assumed that we could figure it out, I guess, but the authors of this text actually define it. It's a threat to any kind of validity. It's something that can cause problems with the validity of that experiment. So anything that can interfere or cause problems is a threat. It's an old phrase, something that has been around for a while. That's why it sounds kind of weird. Anyway, so internal validity relates to the question about whether or not something else could have caused your results besides your independent variable. And so the authors discuss some of the kinds of internal validity threats that you would want to be aware of, and many of you may not do research, but when you are reading something, reading a journal article, something reported in the media, which happens a lot. The media will provide a summary or an abstract or whatever of a study, and you would want to go to the original study to see if the person who wrote that summary or article actually knew what they were talking about and summarized it well. So even if you never do your own experiment, which is good practice, even if you never do it, it's still really important to understand what these concepts mean so that you can be good critical thinking consumers of research. And that's really the whole point of this book and of classes and college in general anyway. Okay, so history, maturation, an old term that's sort of, been dragged along in a way, but maturation, the authors talk about maturational changes are more likely to occur in an experiment that uses repeated measurements of the dB because experimental participants are involved in the research for a longer period of time. You should attempt to safeguard against such changes if your experiment requires long sessions for your participants. So the question is, how do you do that? Critical thinking question for you. And then they talk about testing, practice effect, reactive measures. You can read about those. Then they talk about attitude questionnaires that are used a lot in psychology, especially social psychology. And then the non-reactive measures, or the reactive measures, is kind of related to response set. So those are pretty similar. I think they have some overlap. Again, what can you do to avoid this problem of reactive measures in your research? So they discuss non-reactive measures. Instrument decay, instrumentation, so how that can affect internal validity. And then on page 150, the authors say, researchers can often calculate inter-rater reliability to determine whether instrumentation is a problem in a research project. And then a critical thinking question is, what if the participants, the inter-raters, so there are all sorts of things that can affect internal validity along with inter-rater reliability. And so one thing you have to consider, they talk about different things about instrumentation, computers that may break down, judges, raters, just think about how you feel when you fill out, the instructor evaluation for a class, or if you're really ready to go and someone calls you on the phone and they want you to answer a few questions. That affects how people respond. So you want to keep that in mind when you're looking at research data, or thinking about doing your own statistical regression. That really just means that extreme scores have a tendency to come back to average. So if you study really hard for a test and you don't study hard for the other remaining tests in that class, and you get an A on that one test because you studied really hard, and you got a B or a C on the other ones because you didn't study quite so much, then that's more like statistical regression to the mean. You had this really good, test. Maybe it was because you studied and maybe the test questions were a little bit easier. So there are different aspects to that. So that's what statistical regression is. And so when people say regression to the mean, that's what they're talking about. So you just want to be aware that regression to the mean is a possible explanation for higher or lower scores on a repeated or similar test. The authors make the point, too, about statistical regression or regression to the mean. Sometimes it is difficult for people to see this point. They are convinced that the study course must be responsible for the improvement. They're referring to the experiment there. So again, to emphasize, you want to be, if you're a researcher, you want to be open to your biases. You want to be really thinking about these different kinds of threats and critically analyzing them to see which ones might actually be affecting your results. If you don't, someone else will, I guarantee it. Selection. So we've talked about randomization. We talked about different methods to obtain participants. So selection refers to even though you might be randomly selecting participants, they still could come from a group that has differences from the general population, which can affect your ability to generalize. So this is one area where sometimes people think they're getting a random sample, but they're actually not random in the true sense of scientific randomness. And so they talk about an example of using soap opera viewers and non-soap opera viewers as a group to do a study about rape. Probably not the best way to study the impact of that episode. So a critical thinking question for you, what would be a better way to study the content of a soap opera episode that contained rape? Or would there be a better way to examine that sort of question? They talk about mortality. So mortality is about dropout rate. So how many people began, how many people dropped out, and what happened to those who dropped out, and how are they different from the people who stayed in? Those are the kinds of questions, for example, that college personnel think about when they're looking at retention. What's different about the people who stay in classes? What's different about the people who drop out? Or is there just a general, a bunch of people have a bad semester kind of thing? And then interactions with selection. So differences between the groups. With other aspects of threats to internal validity. Diffusion of treatment, this is a challenge, especially in therapeutic modalities. If you're comparing one kind of modality like cognitive behavioralism to something else, and somebody has experience with one, or somebody has read about the modality or something like that, that they or people talk to each other, so that's one example they give, then that can diffuse your treatment as the variable. So the authors reflect on how you can protect internal validity, and so there are different controls that people have come up with, creative stuff going on there, and they mention, so I want to reinforce, how important is internal validity, and they say it is the most important property of any experiment. The most important property of any experiment. Very interesting. You cannot count on your statistical tests to provide the necessary control functions for you. So that's a really important point too. Some people think you can, but statistics are, merely tabulating data. They're not doing any. They don't have any sort of control method. And then the authors talk about external validity, how generalizing your results to the population. So why do we care about that? I asked that before. Why do we care about generalization? And that's because most of the time people want to be able to expand their results. Not everybody, not all the time. Research doesn't necessarily have to do that, but most people, most scientists, sort of have that in mind, expanding their results, making them more applicable to other situations and other populations. So that's, I guess, the main, kind of the main reason why we care about generalizability. And so they talk about 3 different aspects of generalization, and then threats to external validity based on the methods. So interaction of testing and treatment. So sensitizing participants, and how treatment effect is found only for a specific sample of participants, and they have a figure about that on page 160. It's a way to try to control for this kind of interaction, the pre-test and post-test control group design. Reactive arrangements. So again, people reacting to the experimenter. I read or saw a video actually about an interesting study talking about reactive arrangements. It's really cool. I think I saw it through PBS maybe, or BBC. Maybe it's BBC. They're reporting on some studies done, and one of them was where experimenters set up a situation where they were testing for, what's the concept? It's a social psychology experiment, and I'm blanking on the word for it. But anyway, so they wanted to see if a hot beverage or a cold beverage would affect the way a participant reacted to one of the researchers. So there was deception involved in the study. The participants just thought that they were providing feedback about how they perceived a person in an interview and whether or not they would hire that person. And amazingly enough, it still amazes me when I think about it. These human behavior is quite fascinating. Amazingly enough, if someone held a cold beverage, and there's a long story, I won't go into it, but if someone held a cold beverage while riding the elevator to the room where they were going to, be involved in this fake study, deceptive study practice, if they held a cold beverage, that participant rated the interviewee lower and more often said they would not hire them than they did while holding a hot beverage or a warm beverage. So the sham person who was taking them to the room they were supposed to go in, they would get on the elevator and then ask them to hold this cup of whatever it was. And so they talked about how they controlled for all these other kinds of variables, and they believed that the beverage, the temperature of the beverage, was the reason why people responded to the way they did. And so I think about that as, my role as a counselor at a college and things like that. And oh my gosh, are people responding to me because, they just came out of the rain? Who knows how that affects people? So we are very, very reactive to things, I think is the point of that. And sometimes we will not know it. Reactive arrangements. Demand characteristics. So we have these unintentional, sometimes, mannerisms, or, how we come across or whatever, and that may influence how participants respond. I know I was, kind of conscious of this when I was doing the interviews with the battered women, trying not to, I don't know if I did, I was successful in not, but trying not to, emphasize a particular aspect of a question that I was asking or not. So, something to consider. Multiple treatment interference. So, they mentioned Ebbinghouse's study about nonsense syllables and memory, and how he surmised, or he concluded, that people remembered certain numbers of nonsense words, but others critiqued his conclusions and said that it had to do more with how much a person practiced. So that's why one reason why peer review is so important is because sometimes we're looking at information. I know, I was going through this when I was analyzing my results for my research. Sometimes we're looking at the information and it's hard not to see something that isn't really there. And then threats to external validity based on participants. So they talk about comparing species to another species, and this is a really important point. It's interesting in medical research. People justify their use of animal subjects and generalizing the results of their studies to humans. But yet, when when there's a debate about is it ethical to use to harm animals in research, they say, well, they're not enough like humans that we can give them the same rights as humans. So, so it is a tricky topic, I think, and people do this a lot, though. They generalize animal behavior to human behavior a lot, and sometimes it may be appropriate and fairly accurate, and sometimes not. So to talk about convenient sampling, not a good way to do research, but it's done a lot. It's understandable that it's done a lot, but you just want to keep that in mind about the results if you're reading a research study done with a convenient sample. They mentioned on page 164 about differences between adolescents and adults, and between college students and other late adolescents, and that other kinds of psychological factors might be producing the effective results rather than the participants. They talk about developmental research as well, and then age and research. So generalizing information from an older population to a younger, and vice versa. And then they talk about generalizing findings from one sex to another. So in the past it was quite common. I don't know how much it's changed, but I know it's changed some. But in the past it was very common to only use males in medical studies because researchers, doctors said, well, females and all their crazy hormones just will mess up our study. And that was one of the most common ones I heard. But people, for that very reason, said you must utilize women in medical research as well. So they go into some detail about, this issue of, sex, species, ethnicity, those kinds of things. So when you have a group of participants, how well can you really generalize your results to other populations? So you have to look at that. And then they talk about, is external validity always necessary? And so they say that this one author, Mook, argued that our concern with external validity is necessary only when we are trying to predict real-life behavior in the real world. Mook pointed out 4 alternative goals of research that do not stress external validity. We may want to find out if something can happen, not whether it usually happens, but can it happen? We may want to be predicting from the real world to the lab. So you want to see if it kind of does the same thing or not in the lab. So you're controlling for a lot of internal stuff as opposed to external stuff. Can we see if something occurs in the lab, which is an unnatural setting, then maybe the validity might be strengthened that way because it's being replicated in an unnatural setting. And if you only do this once, that's not proof that it is some evidence that can be used. And then they may, somebody may want to study something that doesn't have a real world application or analogy. So external validity, it's important as is internal validity, but sometimes a researcher may not need to focus on it as much as another study. So again, the research question drives this aspect of it, whether or not how important internal validity is, how important external validity is. And then they discuss replication. They also make a great comment on page 168 near the top. If you attempted to devise an experiment that answered every threat to external validity that we listed, and really the same goes for internal, you might be old and gray before you completed the experiment. So it's really true, and so you have to make judgment calls. Researchers make judgment calls every time they do a research study about what they're going to focus on and what is going to be the important thing for them. So what is the conclusion regarding external validity? We believe it is unrealistic to expect every or any experiment to be applicable to the entire world of animals or people. That's probably a myth anyway. Nonetheless, we also believe that you should strive to make your experiment as externally valid as possible. When you have choices, opt for the choices that will increase the external validity of your findings. So I would concur with that conclusion. All right, thank you for your time and attention. Aloha.